The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and amber as Aisha hummed a cheerful tune. Her backpack slung over her shoulder. Her curly hair bounced with each step. Her energy infectious as she skipped down the sidewalk toward the park. It was her favorite time of day, the hour between school and dinner, when she could leave behind the weight of math problems and science facts and simply play. The park was her sanctuary, a place where laughter echoed and friendships blossomed. As Aisha approached the entrance, the familiar sight of children swinging and running greeted her. The towering oak trees provided shade, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. She spotted her friends near the jungle gym, waving eagerly. Her smile widened as she quickened her pace. "Tag, you're it," one of her friends called as Aisha dropped her backpack by the bench. She giggled and darted after her friend, her sneakers kicking up small clouds of dust. The world seemed perfect in that moment, carefree, joyful, and alive with possibility. But the illusion shattered as an unfamiliar figure entered the park. Officer Bradley's presence was impossible to ignore. Dressed in his crisp blue uniform, he strode into the park with a rigid, almost menacing authority. His pale face was set in a scowl, his eyes scanning the playground like a predator searching for prey. He carried an air of superiority, the badge on his chest gleaming in the evening light. His gaze locked onto Aisha. At first, she didn't notice. She was too busy ducking behind a slide, her laughter ringing out as she avoided being tagged. But as Bradley approached, his shadow loomed over her like a storm cloud. "You there, girl," he barked, his voice slicing through the air. Aisha froze. Her friends stopped mid-play, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. Aisha turned slowly, her heart thumping against her ribcage. "Yes, sir," she said softly, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" Bradley demanded, his tone sharp and accusatory. I'm just playing," she stammered, glancing at her friends for support. They shrank back, unwilling to draw attention to themselves. "This park isn't for you," Bradley said, stepping closer. "Move along, now." Aisha blinked, struggling to comprehend his words. "But, I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Bradley's face twisted with disdain. "Don't talk back to me," he snapped. "I said, leave." Tears welled in Aisha's eyes. But she stood her ground. "Why?" she asked, her small voice carrying a mixture of fear and defiance. "Why can't I stay?" Bradley's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring. "Don't test me, girl," he said, his hand resting ominously on the baton at his hip. "You're trespassing." Last warning. The park had fallen silent. Parents and children alike watched the scene unfold, their faces etched with shock and discomfort. Some looked away, unwilling to intervene. Others whispered among themselves, their expressions a mixture of pity and outrage. Aisha's small frame seemed to shrink under the weight of Bradley's glare. Her mind raced, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might drown out the world. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into the shadows of the trees. But before she could respond, a voice rang out. "What's going on here?" The question, calm yet commanding, came from a man approaching the scene. Michael Johnson, Aisha's father, exuded a quiet strength. His tailored suit and confident stride contrasted sharply with the rigid aggression of Bradley. "Daddy," Aisha whimpered, running to him. She clung to his leg, burying her face in his side. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning his sharp gaze to Bradley. "Officer, is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with steel. Bradley straightened, his posture defensive. "This girl was loitering. I asked her to leave." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Loitering? She's a child. She was playing." Bradley's jaw tightened. "This isn't about that. We have rules, and I enforce them." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Rules? Or biases?" A tense silence settled over the park. Bradley opened his mouth to retort but hesitated under Michael's piercing stare. The lawyer in Michael was already at work, dissecting the officer's actions and words, noting every nuance. "Come on, Aisha," Michael said finally, his tone softening as he addressed his daughter. "Let's go." As they walked away, Michael placed a protective arm around Aisha's shoulders, but his mind churned with anger and determination. He had seen this before, this quiet yet overt racism disguised as law enforcement. He knew the damage it could cause, especially to someone as young and innocent as Aisha. Once they reached their car, Michael knelt to Aisha's level. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Aisha nodded, though tears still glistened in her eyes. "Why did he hate me, Daddy?" she asked, her voice breaking. Michael's heart clenched. "Because some people judge others by the color of their skin instead of who they are," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "But that doesn't make it right. And we're not going to let him get away with it." As they drove home, Michael's resolve hardened. He would not let this moment define Aisha's childhood. He would not let her grow up thinking she was less than anyone else. And most importantly, he would hold Bradley accountable for his actions. Injustice had met the wrong family. Michael's grip on the steering wheel tightened as they left the park. He cast a glance at Aisha in the rearview mirror. Her small frame huddled in the back seat, clutching her backpack like a lifeline. The image broke something deep within him. Aisha was his light, his pride, everything he fought to protect in a world that often refused to see her the way he did, bright, kind, and full of promise. And yet, here she was, tears streaking her cheeks, her joy stolen in broad daylight. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady his emotions. He couldn't afford to let Aisha see him unravel. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I want you to tell me everything. From the beginning." Aisha sniffled and looked up, her eyes shimmering with confusion and pain. "I was just playing, Daddy," she began, her voice trembling. "Me and my friends were playing tag. And he came out of nowhere. He yelled at me to leave. But I didn't know why. I wasn't doing anything wrong." Her words faltered, and she buried her face in her hands. Michael pulled the car over to the side of the road. He turned around to face her fully, his eyes softening. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly, his voice low but charged with conviction. "Do you hear me, Aisha? None of this was your fault." "But he was so angry," she whispered, "like I wasn't supposed to be there." Michael's chest tightened. He knew all too well what she meant. It wasn't the first time he'd heard those words, he'd lived them, growing up as a black boy in the South. But hearing them from his daughter ignited a fire within him that he hadn't felt in years. As they pulled back onto the road, Michael's mind raced. He replayed the scene in his head, dissecting every detail. Bradley's aggressive posture, his harsh tone, and the way he seemed to single Aisha out without reason. It wasn't just about Aisha. Michael realized, it was about something far larger. Bradley's actions weren't an isolated incident. They were a symptom of a system that had allowed men like him to wield power unchecked for too long. When they arrived home, Michael carried Aisha's backpack for her, his other hand resting protectively on her shoulder. His wife, Angela, was already at the door, concern etched across her face. "What happened?" she asked, her voice sharp with worry. Michael exchanged a glance with her, a silent communication passing between them. "Let's get inside," he said, once Aisha was settled in the living room with a glass of juice and her favorite blanket. Michael recounted the incident to Angela in hushed tones. Her face darkened as he spoke, her hands balling into fists. "He did what?" she hissed. "He targeted her," Michael said simply. "And he did it because of her skin." Angela's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. "What are we going to do about it?" Michael's jaw set. "We're going to fight." That night, after Aisha had fallen asleep, Michael sat in his home office, surrounded by stacks of legal books and case files. The room was his sanctuary, a place where he had fought countless battles in the name of justice. But this case was different. This wasn't just a client or a cause, this was his daughter. He opened his laptop and began his research. Bradley's name wasn't hard to find. A few keystrokes revealed a troubling pattern. Complaints of excessive force, allegations of bias, internal investigations that mysteriously went nowhere. Michael's anger simmered as he read on. The system had protected Bradley for years, shielding him from accountability. But not this time. Michael drafted a detailed complaint, outlining the incident and citing legal precedents that supported Aisha's rights. He emailed it to a trusted colleague, a fellow civil rights attorney, for review. Then he began reaching out to witnesses from the park, starting with the parents who had been there. Most were hesitant to get involved, but a few agreed to speak out, their voices trembling with anger and guilt. "I should have stepped in," one mother admitted over the phone. "But I was scared. That man, the way he looked at her. It wasn't right. It wasn't your fault." Michael reassured her. "But if you're willing to testify, we can make sure he never does this to anyone else." By the time Michael closed his laptop, the first light of dawn was creeping through the curtains. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion settling in, but the fire in his chest refused to die. This was just the beginning. The next morning, as Michael prepared Aisha's breakfast, he noticed a change in her demeanor. She was quieter than usual, her usual chatter replaced by a heavy silence. When he sat across from her at the table, she avoided his gaze. "Aisha," he said gently, "I need you to listen to me. What happened yesterday, it doesn't define you. That man, he was wrong. And we're going to prove it." Aisha hesitated, then looked up at him. "But what if he comes back? What if he's mad at me?" Michael leaned forward, his voice firm. "You don't have to be afraid of him. Aisha, you have me, and I will never let anything happen to you. Ever." She nodded slowly, some of the tension in her shoulders easing. As Michael drove her to school, he couldn't help but notice the way she clutched her backpack tightly, her eyes darting toward every police car they passed. The sight only strengthened his resolve. Bradley hadn't just hurt her, he had stolen her sense of safety. And Michael was determined to get it back. That evening, Michael held a family meeting. Angela, Aisha, and even their teenage son, Marcus, gathered in the living room. Michael explained his plan, filing a formal complaint, rallying community support, and, if necessary, taking Bradley to court. "This isn't just about us," he said. "It's about standing up for what's right. Aisha, you have a voice, and when you're ready, I want you to use it. We'll be with you every step of the way." Aisha looked uncertain, but Marcus spoke up, his voice steady. "We've got your back, Aisha, always." For the first time since the incident, Aisha smiled. It was small and tentative, but it was enough to remind Michael why he was doing this. The fight was far from over. But Michael knew one thing for certain. Bradley had underestimated the wrong family. The morning was crisp and clear. But Michael's mind was clouded with strategy as he stepped out of his car and into the bustling downtown law office. He had barely slept since the incident at the park, but his resolve had only strengthened. The weight of what had happened to Aisha, his little girl, his pride and joy, propelled him forward with singular focus. Today, the fight for justice began. Inside the office, his longtime paralegal, Clara, was already waiting for him with a stack of files and a steaming cup of coffee. Her expression was a mix of determination and concern. "I've started pulling records on Officer Bradley," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. "You're not going to like what you see." Michael opened the folder and scanned the documents. Bradley's record was riddled with complaints, excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics. Yet, time and again, the complaints had been dismissed. The investigations quietly closed. Michael's jaw clenched as he flipped through the pages. "This isn't just about Aisha," he muttered. "This is about a pattern, a system that lets people like him keep their power." Clara nodded. "And it's going to take more than a strongly worded letter to bring him down." Michael sat back, his mind already racing. "We need witnesses, evidence, something they can't ignore or sweep under the rug." By midday, Michael was deep into his work, reaching out to parents who had been at the park that day. The responses were mixed. Some were eager to support him, angered by what they had seen. Others were hesitant, fearful of retaliation or reluctant to get involved. One call, in particular, stood out. It was from a young mother named Elena, who had been sitting on a bench near the playground when the incident unfolded. "I saw everything," Elena said, her voice trembling. "That officer, he was out of line. The way he spoke to her, the way he looked at her, it wasn't right. Would you be willing to testify?" Michael asked, his tone careful but hopeful. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I want to," Elena said finally. "But I'm scared. What if they come after me?" Michael's voice softened. "I understand your fear, Elena, but the only way we can stop this from happening again is by standing together. You wouldn't just be helping Aisha, you'd be helping every family who's ever been treated like this." Another pause, then a deep sigh. "Okay," Elena said, "I'll do it." Michael hung up, feeling a flicker of hope. It was a small victory, but a vital one. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Michael filed a formal complaint against Bradley, citing racial discrimination and abuse of power. He held meetings with community leaders and civil rights activists, rallying support and raising awareness. The story began to gain traction in local media, drawing attention to the broader issue of systemic racism in law enforcement. Aisha's name was at the center of it all, though Michael and Angela were careful to shield her from the public eye as much as possible. At home, Aisha struggled to understand the magnitude of what was happening. She knew her father was fighting for her, but the attention and the weight of the situation often left her feeling overwhelmed. One evening, as Michael sat at his desk reviewing legal precedents, Aisha appeared in the doorway. She clutched a stuffed bear to her chest, her expression hesitant. "Daddy?" she said softly. Michael set down his pen and turned to her. "What is it, sweetheart?" She hesitated, then stepped into the room. "Do you think we'll win?" Her question caught him off guard. Michael leaned back in his chair, studying her small, earnest face. "It's not just about winning, Aisha," he said gently. "It's about making sure the truth is heard. It's about standing up for what's right." "But what if no one believes us?" she asked, her voice wavering. Michael reached out and took her hand. "The truth has a way of shining through, even when people try to ignore it. And no matter what happens, I promise you this, you are brave, you are strong, and you did nothing wrong. Don't ever forget that." Aisha nodded, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She climbed into his lap, and for a moment, Michael allowed himself to just hold her, letting the weight of his resolve rest alongside the weight of her small frame. The legal battle truly began when Michael's complaint prompted an official investigation. Officer Bradley was placed on administrative leave, a small but significant victory. The police department, however, was quick to defend him, issuing a statement that described the incident as a misunderstanding and dismissed allegations of racial bias. Michael wasn't surprised. He knew this was a fight against not just one man, but an entire system built to protect people like Bradley. And he was ready. The discovery process unearthed damning evidence. Clara had managed to obtain body camera footage from Bradley's patrol unit that day. Though the video was short, it captured Bradley's hostile tone and the baseless nature of his accusations against Aisha. It also revealed something chilling. After forcing Aisha out of the park, Bradley muttered under his breath, "Kids like that don't belong here." Michael watched the footage with a mix of anger and grim satisfaction. This was the smoking gun he needed. As the trial approached, the stakes grew higher. The media coverage intensified, with some outlets painting Michael as a hero and others questioning his motives. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, some chanting for justice, others defending Bradley. Inside their home, the Johnson family felt the pressure mounting. Angela did her best to keep the atmosphere calm for Aisha and Marcus. But the tension was palpable. Marcus, now a teenager, struggled with his own anger. "I don't get it, Dad," he said one night, pacing the living room. "Why do we have to prove she didn't do anything wrong? Why isn't it obvious?" "Because the world doesn't always see what's right in front of them," Michael said. "That's why we have to fight, to make them see." The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Michael stood tall at the plaintiff's table, his presence commanding but calm. Across the room, Bradley sat with his defense attorney, his expression one of cold indifference. The proceedings were tense from the start. Bradley's lawyer argued that he had acted within his authority, claiming he had been enforcing park regulations. Michael countered with witness testimony, the body camera footage, and a thorough dismantling of Bradley's claims. Elena, the young mother from the park, gave a powerful testimony. "I saw him single her out," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He wasn't enforcing rules, he was bullying a child." But the most impactful moment came when Aisha took the stand. Dressed in a simple dress and clutching her father's hand, she walked to the witness chair with quiet determination. The courtroom fell silent as she recounted the events of that day. Her voice soft but unwavering. "I didn't understand why he was so angry at me," she said. "I just wanted to play with my friends." Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the innocence that had been stolen. As the trial continued, the truth became undeniable. Michael's case was airtight, his arguments bolstered by evidence and testimony. The jury deliberated for hours. But when they returned, the verdict was clear. Officer Bradley was found guilty of misconduct and racial discrimination. The courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and tears. But Michael remained composed, his focus on Aisha. He knelt down to her level, his hands on her shoulders. "You did it, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You stood up, and they listened." Aisha smiled, a real, radiant smile that filled Michael's heart with pride. The fight wasn't over, but this victory was a step forward. And for Aisha, it was a reminder that her voice mattered. Michael's footsteps echoed through the courthouse lobby the next morning. Each step deliberate, measured. His suit was pressed, his briefcase in hand, but it wasn't just professionalism driving his composure, it was purpose. He was no stranger to legal battles. But this one was personal. His daughter's innocence, her sense of belonging, had been trampled under the weight of one man's prejudice. That weight now rested squarely on his shoulders. As he stepped into his office, Clara greeted him with her usual efficiency. "Michael," she said, placing a fresh folder on his desk. "You're going to want to see this." Michael raised an eyebrow, opening the folder. Inside were transcripts of depositions from past complaints filed against Officer Bradley. The stories were eerily similar: intimidation, baseless accusations, veiled threats. Most cases had been quietly dismissed, the victims too fearful or too resigned to push back. "This guy's a walking lawsuit," Clara said, her tone bristling with indignation. "How is he still on the force?" Michael closed the folder with a snap. "Because the system protects people like him. But not this time." Clara's eyes gleamed with approval. "So, what's the plan?" "First, we bring the department into this," Michael said, leaning forward. "They've enabled him for years. If they want to protect him, they'll have to explain why." The first formal meeting with the city's legal counsel was tense. Michael sat across the table from a team of city attorneys, their expressions guarded. At the head of the table sat Chief Daniels, the head of the police department, his presence a calculated show of authority. "Mr. Johnson," one of the attorneys began, her tone clipped, "we've reviewed your complaint, and while we take these allegations seriously, we believe this incident has been blown out of proportion." Michael's eyes hardened. Blown out of proportion? A decorated officer targeted an innocent child, humiliated her in public, and violated her civil rights. That's not an incident, it's a systemic failure. Chief Daniels cleared his throat. "Officer Bradley has served this community for over 15 years. He's received commendations for his work. And yet," Michael countered, sliding the folder of complaints across the table, "these commendations didn't stop him from accumulating a record of misconduct. How many more children does he have to target before it's a pattern?" The room fell silent. The city attorneys exchanged uneasy glances. "This will go to court," Michael said, his voice calm but resolute. "You can either work with us to seek justice, or you can stand in the way. But make no mistake, I will not stop until accountability is served." As the case moved forward, Michael poured every ounce of his energy into preparation. Witnesses were contacted, their statements meticulously documented. Clara worked tirelessly by his side, compiling evidence and digging through years of departmental records. The deeper they dug, the more damning the picture became. Officer Bradley wasn't just a rogue cop, he was a symptom of a larger issue. Michael also began to involve the community. He attended town hall meetings, spoke at churches and schools, and connected with local activists. The story of Aisha's experience resonated with families across the city, many of whom had their own stories of discrimination to share. One such meeting was held at a local community center. Michael stood at the podium, addressing a room filled with parents, activists, and concerned citizens. "When my daughter was forced out of that park," he said, his voice steady, "she didn't just lose a moment of her childhood, she lost trust. Trust in the people who are supposed to protect her. That's what we're fighting for. The right for every child to feel safe, to feel valued, regardless of the color of their skin." The room erupted in applause. Among the crowd, Aisha sat with Angela and Marcus, her eyes wide as she watched her father speak. For the first time since the incident, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this fight wasn't just about what had happened to her. Maybe it was about something bigger. As the trial date approached, tensions rose. The media coverage intensified, with local news stations running nightly segments on the case. Some portrayed Michael as a hero, a father fighting for justice. Others accused him of overreacting, framing the case as a personal vendetta against law enforcement. The police union also entered the fray, publicly defending Bradley and accusing Michael of trying to tarnish the department's reputation. Michael ignored the noise, focusing instead on the task at hand. But the strain on his family was undeniable. One evening, as Michael sat at the kitchen table reviewing his opening arguments, Angela placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've been at this for hours," she said softly. You need to rest. Michael shook his head. I can't afford to. They're going to throw everything they have at us. Angie, if I slip up even once. You won't, Angela interrupted, her tone firm, because you're not just doing this for Aisha. You're doing this for every parent who's ever had to see their child suffer. Her words stayed with him long after she went to bed. The first day of the trial was electric. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Michael's heart pounded as he rose to deliver his opening statement. But his voice was steady. This case is not just about a single act of discrimination. He began, his gaze sweeping the jury. It's about a culture of bias. A system that allows prejudice to thrive. My daughter, Aisha, was targeted because of the color of her skin. Today, we seek not just justice for her, but accountability for a system that has failed too many. The prosecution's case was strong, but Bradley's defense was relentless. They painted him as a dedicated officer who had acted in the interest of public safety. Arguing that his actions were misinterpreted, they attempted to cast doubt on the witnesses, suggesting that their accounts were influenced by media coverage. But Michael was ready. He dismantled their arguments piece by piece, presenting a compelling narrative supported by evidence and testimony. Witnesses like Elena, the young mother from the park, spoke with conviction, their words painting a vivid picture of Bradley's aggression. When the body camera footage was played in court, a hush fell over the room. The audio captured Bradley's hostile tone, his thinly veiled disdain. The words, "Kids like that don't belong here," echoed through the courtroom. A stark reminder of the prejudice at the heart of the case. A pivotal moment came when Aisha took the stand. Michael had prepared her carefully. But as she sat in the witness chair, her small frame dwarfed by the courtroom, he felt a pang of worry. Could she handle the pressure? But Aisha surprised everyone. Her voice was soft but steady as she recounted the events of that day. I didn't understand why he was so angry at me, she said, her eyes welling with tears. I just wanted to play with my friends. Her words struck a chord, cutting through the legal arguments and reaching the humanity of everyone in the room. Even the toughest jurors couldn't hide their emotion. When the jury retired to deliberate, Michael sat with his family, his hands clasped tightly together. Hours felt like days as they waited for the verdict. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson read the decision, guilty. Officer Bradley was found culpable of misconduct and racial discrimination. The room erupted in a mix of cheers and tears. Michael turned to Aisha, his eyes shining with pride. We did it, sweetheart, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We stood up, and they listened. For Aisha, it wasn't just a victory, it was a moment of reclaiming her dignity, her voice, and her place in the world. For Michael, it was a reminder that justice, though often elusive, was worth fighting for. The courtroom verdict brought an immediate wave of relief and triumph. But as the Johnson family stepped outside into the cool air, the noise of protesters and the flash of cameras reminded Michael that their fight wasn't entirely over. The crowd was a chaotic mix of supporters chanting Aisha's name and detractors holding signs defending Officer Bradley. Angela gripped Aisha's hand tightly, shielding her from the overwhelming scene. Michael raised a hand in acknowledgement of the cheers but kept his pace brisk. This was a moment of victory. But it was also a moment for reflection. Justice had been served in court, but the systemic change he sought wouldn't come overnight. Back at home, the atmosphere was markedly different. For the first time in weeks, the Johnsons could breathe freely. Aisha was back in her element, playing with Marcus in the living room, her laughter filling the space like a soothing melody. Michael and Angela watched from the couch, their hands intertwined. She's smiling again, Angela said, her voice soft with relief. Michael nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. She's strong, stronger than I realized. But this, what happened, will stay with her. It's part of her story now. And part of yours, Angela added, her gaze steady. You fought for her, for all of us. That matters. Michael leaned back, letting her words sink in. The case had been grueling, both legally and emotionally, but it had also sparked something bigger, a growing call for accountability that stretched far beyond their family. In the weeks following the verdict, the ripple effects of the trial became evident. Officer Bradley's dismissal was confirmed, but the fallout extended to the police department itself. Chief Daniels announced an internal review of department policies. bowing to pressure from community leaders and activists emboldened by Michael's victory. The city council organized public forums to discuss police reform, and Michael was invited to speak. Standing before a packed auditorium, he recounted Aisha's experience with a measured but impassioned tone. "This isn't just about one officer," he said, his voice steady but resonant. "It's about a system that allowed his behavior to go unchecked. It's about ensuring that no other child has to go through what my daughter did." The audience erupted into applause, and Michael felt a flicker of hope. Change wouldn't come easily, but the conversation had started. Meanwhile, Aisha began to find her own voice. Encouraged by her parents, she wrote about her experience for a school essay competition. Her piece, titled, "My Day at the Park," was both poignant and powerful, blending her youthful perspective with a maturity beyond her years. "When I think about that day," she wrote, "I don't just feel sad or scared. I feel strong, because my dad showed me that standing up for what's right is more important than being afraid." Her essay won first place, and her teacher read it aloud during a school assembly. As Aisha stood on stage to accept her award, the applause from her peers was deafening. For the first time since the incident, she felt not just seen, but celebrated. But not everyone was eager to move forward. Bradley's supporters continued to stir up controversy, with some accusing the Johnsons of exploiting the case for attention. Online forums buzzed with vitriol, targeting Michael's character and questioning his motives. Angela stumbled upon one such thread late one night and immediately felt her chest tighten with anger. She showed Michael the screen, her voice trembling. "How can they say these things? After everything we've been through?" Michael placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "They're holding on to a narrative that excuses their own biases. It's easier to blame us than to confront the truth. But it's so unfair," Angela whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "It is," Michael agreed, "but that's why we keep going. Not for them, for Aisha. For every family who's been silenced." Michael's resolve led him to take the fight beyond their local community. He partnered with national civil rights organizations, joining a coalition pushing for broader police accountability measures. His courtroom victory became a case study in legal seminars. His name featured in articles and interviews. One afternoon, as he prepared for a televised panel discussion, Marcus approached him. The teenager had been quiet throughout much of the ordeal, processing the events in his own way. "Dad," Marcus said, his voice hesitant, "do you ever get tired of fighting?" Michael paused, considering the weight of the question. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I think about what happens if I stop. If we all stop. The fight isn't just about winning, it's about making things better. Even if it's just one step at a time." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I want to help, maybe not in the same way. But, I want to do something." Michael smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "You already are, son, just by being the person you are." As months turned into a year, the Johnsons found a new rhythm. The scars of the past lingered, but they no longer defined them. Aisha began to thrive again, her confidence blossoming in ways that even Michael and Angela hadn't expected. She joined a local youth group focused on community outreach, eager to give back. One evening, as the family walked through the park, the very park where the incident had occurred, Aisha stopped in front of the jungle gym. The sight of it stirred a mix of emotions in Michael, but Aisha's face was calm, even serene. "Can I play for a bit?" she asked, glancing up at her parents. Michael hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course." As Aisha ran off to join the other children, Angela slipped her hand into Michael's. "She's taking it back," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Her place, her joy." Michael watched Aisha climb the jungle gym, her laughter ringing out as she reached the top. For a moment, the weight of everything they had endured seemed to lift, replaced by a profound sense of peace. "This is what it's all for," Michael said quietly. Marcus, every kid who deserves to feel free." Angela leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. They still had work to do, there would always be more to fight for, but in that moment, they allowed themselves to simply be. Together, whole, triumphant. The story of the Johnson family became more than just a headline or a legal case. It became a symbol of resilience. A reminder that even the smallest voices could demand to be heard. And though the road ahead was long, Michael knew they were ready for it. Together, they had proven that justice wasn't just an abstract ideal, It was a promise worth fighting for. The days following the verdict were a whirlwind of emotions. The Johnsons, though victorious in the courtroom, quickly realized that the fight for justice had only begun. The community was divided, the media was relentless, and the weight of public opinion, both supportive and hostile, hung heavy over their lives. Yet, amid the chaos, there was a quiet resolve within the family. They had faced the storm together, and they would continue to do so. Michael sat at the dining table late one evening, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the dishwasher. He sifted through a thick file of correspondence, letters from supporters, legal documents, and emails from advocacy groups. Each one told a story. Families who had faced discrimination, individuals who had been silenced, communities yearning for change. Angela walked into the room, her footsteps light as she approached him. "You're still at it," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Michael glanced up, a tired smile on his face. "I can't seem to stop. There's so much work to do." She pulled out a chair and sat beside him. "You've already done so much. Michael, you fought for Aisha. You gave people hope." Michael leaned back, rubbing his temples. "It doesn't feel like enough. For every family we've helped, there are a dozen more out there still struggling. And the system, it's so much bigger than one man, one case." Angela studied him for a moment, her eyes softening. "Then we keep going, but not at the expense of each other. You don't have to carry this alone." Michael reached for her hand, his expression full of gratitude. "I couldn't do this without you." In the weeks that followed, Michael's role as an advocate expanded. He was invited to speak at rallies, sit on panels, and collaborate with national organizations pushing for police reform. One of the most significant invitations came from a group lobbying for a new state law, legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within law enforcement. The proposed law, named the Aisha Justice Act, sought to mandate body camera use, establish independent review boards for police misconduct cases, and require racial bias training for all officers. The honor of having the act named after his daughter was both humbling and bittersweet for Michael. At the bill's unveiling ceremony, Michael stood before a crowd of lawmakers, activists, and citizens. Angela, Marcus, and Aisha sat in the front row, their faces beaming with pride. "When my daughter was forced out of that park," Michael began, his voice steady, "it wasn't just an attack on her innocence, it was an attack on the very idea of justice. But justice isn't a given. It's something we have to fight for, something we have to protect. The Aisha Justice Act is a step forward, not just for my family, but for every family that believes in fairness and accountability." The crowd erupted in applause, and Michael caught Aisha's eye. She smiled at him, a mix of pride and understanding. She was beginning to grasp the enormity of what her family's struggle represented. But not everyone celebrated the progress. As Michael's profile grew, so did the backlash. Threatening emails began to arrive, and online forums teemed with hateful comments. A particularly venomous article accused Michael of exploiting his daughter's experience for political gain. Angela was the first to see the article. Her hands trembled as she showed it to Michael. "They're going too far," she said, her voice breaking. "This isn't just about you anymore, it's about our family. Our kids." Michael read the article silently, his jaw tightening. "They're trying to intimidate us," he said finally, "but we're not backing down." The next day, Michael arranged for a security system to be installed at their home. He also spoke to Aisha and Marcus, explaining the situation with care. "You might hear things, see things, that are upsetting," he told them, "but I want you to remember, we're doing this because it's the right thing. And we'll face it together." Marcus, now more outspoken, nodded firmly. "They're scared of us because we're making a difference. Let them talk." Aisha, quieter but no less determined, hugged her father. "I'm not scared, Daddy," she said. "Not anymore." As the fight for the Aisha Justice Act gained momentum, Michael found himself drawn into more public debates. One particularly heated exchange occurred during a televised town hall meeting, where he faced off against a representative of the police union. Officer Bradley's actions were isolated, the representative argued. Painting the entire department as biased is unfair and dangerous. Michael's response was measured but powerful. "This isn't about one officer. It's about a system that allowed him to act without consequence. If the department had addressed the complaints against him years ago, my daughter wouldn't have been targeted." Accountability isn't dangerous, it's necessary. The audience erupted into applause. And Michael felt a surge of hope. But the fight was far from over. The bill faced significant opposition in the legislature, with critics arguing that it was too radical. At home, Aisha continued to process her role in the unfolding events. One evening, she approached Michael as he sat in his study. "Daddy," she said, holding a notebook in her hands. "I've been writing something. Can I read it to you?" Michael set down his work and nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." Aisha opened the notebook and began to read. It was a letter, to herself. To her future. In it, she described her feelings of fear and confusion on the day at the park. But also her growth since then. "I used to think being quiet was the same as being safe." She read aloud. "But now I know that speaking up is the only way to make things better. I'm proud of what we're doing, even if it's hard sometimes." Michael felt a lump rise in his throat. "Aisha," he said softly, "that's beautiful. You're so brave." She smiled, her eyes bright. "I learned it from you." The day the Aisha Justice Act was signed into law was a day of celebration. The Johnsons stood together at the signing ceremony, their faces alight with joy. The governor praised Michael's advocacy and Aisha's courage, calling them symbols of hope and change. As the applause faded, Michael turned to his daughter. "This is for you," he said, "and for every kid who deserves a better future." Aisha nodded, her heart full. For the first time since the incident, she felt not just healed, but empowered. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had led them to this moment, a moment of triumph, of justice, of hope. And as the Johnsons walked hand in hand through the crowd, they knew their story wasn't just theirs anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in the power of truth, the strength of family, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow.